Good morning, guys.
Good morning, Ms. Rogers.
Good morning. I'm going to mute everyone because there's a lot of background noise, and then we will have a couple of instructions, and then we will welcome our speaker. Okay.
Whoops. Emily?
Yes, ma'am.
One of my colleagues may be joining in. Her name is Joni Wiley. I'm not for sure, but just if you see a name that you don't know.
All righty.
I'm so impressed. Everybody's up this morning.
That is impressive.
You all are great.
Ms. Rogers.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I've got my class over here and I've got you on my phone, because what I did is I just sent all of my second period away, told them to come to you.
Okay.
Because you have them third also.
Right.
So they should be coming to you. They were all present in my class. I told them what we would be doing Monday, and then I released them so that they could come to you. I told them that you would be keeping roll as well as myself, and that we would be checking, with each other. So I got you. Well, they were all 100% with me, so they all heard what they were supposed to do.
Great.
So I just wanted to let you know that they should be coming into you here soon.
Awesome.
But anyway, I just wanted to make sure, because my third period, I don't know. I'm hoping I sent out through my first period class to tell my third period class, because if they didn't check plan book where I had put all the information, then they won't know to come to this. And I would love to think they all read that, but I'm not quite sure everybody's checking my plan book every day. So,
now let's be a little realistic about that.
That's exactly. Well, here's the deal. Second period should be to you, which is your third period group, because I just told them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sit here and mute myself so that I can just hear the lady. But if my third period class shows up over here, because by that time it'll be 10:15, so it's too late for them to join then. I figure by that point, you've already missed almost an hour.
Right.
So, okay. Well, I just wanted to let you know I was here and make sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Thank you, Coach Hyde. I appreciate that.
All right. Now, I'm going to mute myself. Is that right? I'll still be able to hear her.
Okay. Yes.
Is that right, though? And
Yep.
then that way, background noise or anything, which we're all going to mute, aren't you?
I'm going to mute everyone except her.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Thanks.
We're almost at our 100 participant limit.
Oh, wow.
We're at 98.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So if somebody is not able to get in, then I don't.
Okay. Well, all of mine showed up to class, so I'm going to count them, I can't count them absent
Right.
if they can't make it into that. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. And we're going to record this so we can watch it later if we want
Okay.
to. So.
All right. Well, I'll probably be getting emails, so I'll start checking my email.
Alrighty.
And I think I guess we probably need to let Carla know, because what's going to happen, her phone's going to start ringing off the hook to her.
Yeah. If you'll actually take care of that for me, that would be wonderful.
Okay.
Hey, Miss Rogers.
Yes.
I just got a text from Miss Amber that said that they can't get in. She can't get in, that it's full.
Yeah, we're at our limit right now.
Yeah.
So we're gonna record this, and she is welcome to show it later. But there's no way around the 100-person limit. So
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I was checking, and you can up your subscription. I think it's $50 a month or $60 a month to let in more people.
We're actually on the free school one. We haven't paid for it. So
Got it.
all right. Well, we are at our limit, it looks like. So I'm okay to go ahead and get started. Let me give the kiddos some instruction really quickly, and then we will pass it on over to our speaker.
Okay.
All right, guys. Good morning. Thank you guys so much for being here with us this morning. We have a fabulous guest speaker who is taking precious time out of her schedule to share an incredible opportunity with you all. Her name is Ms. Ann Mollengarden. She is with the Birmingham, I never get the words right, Birmingham Holocaust Education Center. Right. And she is going to share a story with us about her father, who is still alive. He is a survivor of the Holocaust. And so this is an incredible opportunity to listen to this story, especially if you have me right now for 8th grade. We literally just got finished reading Anne Frank, the play, yesterday. So she's going to also speak a little bit about Anne Frank. So I expect you guys to be on your best behavior. I expect to be able to see all faces in frames. I do not want to see ceilings. If we see ceilings and you are not in the frame, remember you're counted as absent. Okay, so please be attentive. In the side of your screen, there's a little chat option. If you have questions that you would like to ask her during our session, you can put it in there. And Ms. Mollengarden, do you want to look at those, or do you want to have me look at those?
Thinking now that because of this format, we might do better to take all the questions at the end, but they can go ahead and log those in, and then I'll let you go in and sort of interview me at the end using their questions. Would that work?
That sounds great.
Okay.
All right. All right, kiddos. So I'm going to mute everyone so that we don't have any background noise. Please make your screen as big as you can. I'm going to make our speaker as our spotlight video. And if you have, as you think of questions, if you want to put them in the chat option, that way we can go back to them at the end. All right. I'm very excited about this, and I'm very, very thankful that Ms. Mollengarden has taken this time out of her busy schedule to share this incredible story with us. Here we go.
Good morning, everybody. And so let me just.
Muted.
Hold on, we're having technical difficulties. All right, Ms. Mollengarden, if you will just unmute yourself.
That would help. That would help.
Sorry. I'm going to mute myself because my dog is going to bark. Heaven forbid.
Okay, so hi, everybody. As you can see, I'm not super adept at this, but I'm learning, as we all are. And what I'm going to share today is my father's story. We have several survivors in Birmingham, about 13. And my dad is now 94 years old. He actually still speaks, but he's not too good with speaking on the computer and using his PowerPoint with that. I am going to share my screen with you, I hope, if I can figure this all out to work correctly, because it not only will have photos and images that will help you visualize this story, but it also has video of him speaking, so you'll get to meet him as well in person. And that way it will be a real person for you. As Ms. Rogers said, if you have questions, put them in the chat box, and then we will go over those questions at the end. And no question is a stupid question, because if you're thinking of it, somebody else is thinking of it. So make sure you do ask those questions. The other thing I want you to bear in mind as I tell you this story is we all know the outcome. We know what happened with the Holocaust, and that 6 million Jews died, 5 million others died. But what we don't realize is that at the time, and as this story is unfolding, this particular family did not know the end result. And so they're having to make decisions with circumstances that they don't know how it's going to impact them. And so you have to kind of sort of take a time capsule back and imagine yourself in this time and how you would make decisions based on your background and what you think might be the future. Okay, so I am going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. And Ms. Rogers, you tell me if it doesn't. Let's see here. I want to get it full screen. There we go. Can everybody see that? Okay, good. Okay, so this is my dad, Robert May. They call him Bob here, and he's from a small town in Germany called Camberg, Germany. This is where Camberg is. As you can see, it's about an hour outside of Frankfurt. Frankfurt is where Anne Frank was born. Frankfurt is the big city, and he's in a very small town. And so it is the same part of Germany, so legislation and so forth that occurred during World War II would have happened at about the same time for both he and for Anne Frank. Anne Frank, I think, is a year older than, would have been a year older than my father. I think it's either a year older or a year younger. This is an image of the town from 1933. It was a medieval town, and can y'all see my pointer? Oh, good, okay. So there was, in medieval towns, they had walls around the town, and this is one of the watchtowers. The wall would have run like this around the central part of the town, and then there would have been 4 other towers. Only 2 are still existing today. This is the lower tower, and this is my dad's family home and store, and it was outside of the old part of town, so to speak. This is his elementary school, which you can see is about a block away. This was the Catholic church in town, which was right next door to the elementary school. So it's a small town. Everybody walked everywhere for the most part. Today, it's a much more burgeoning town. It only had about 2,700 inhabitants and about 63 Jews. So this was a very small little agrarian farming community. These are some of the pictures of the upper and lower tower, which still exists today. This is the upper tower up the street from my dad's home, and this white and next door to it was his home. This is the back of his home, the white. And so you can see this tower was a real landmark in the town, and this is just the lower tower here. Today, they have redone many of these half-timbered homes. On the left, you can see what they used to look like, and this is the way my dad remembered it. Today, they're making it a tourist town, and so they want it to look pretty, and so they've redone them, and they've put window boxes, and it's actually a spa town because there are special mineral waters that are harvested from this area. So this is more what it would have looked like in my dad's time, more muddy, gray, you know, dirt roads. So take yourself back in your time capsule and imagine this is where you are living right now. I'm going to talk a lot about family because family was very important in my dad's story. This is my dad sitting on a bearskin rug, which was sort of the fashionable way to photograph your children at the time. Born in 1926. These are his parents, Flora and Herman. Herman was from Camberg. His family had been there for generations, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. He also fought in World War I where he was injured. My grandmother was, whoops, let's go back. My grandmother was born in a nearby town known as Munzesheim, and their marriage was an arranged marriage, which was very common in the Jewish tradition. So she moved to this town as an outsider, which was always very difficult for her. She was always remained kind of an outsider in this community. My father had two older brothers, Martin and Paul. They were much older than he was. As you can see, Martin was born in 1919, so he's about 7 or 8 years older than my father. So he was almost raised as an only child. When he was in elementary school, his brothers were in high school and beyond. And so that's going to play a key role in his story. So on my grandfather's side, this is Herman, my grandfather. And again, the names are going to come to you. I'll say them over and over, but they are all important. Emma was his oldest sister, my dad's aunt. And she was married for a brief time, but then got divorced, and she lived next door to them. And she was the aunt who sort of spoiled the boys next door. She's going to play a very big role in my dad's story. His uncle Sigmund, although born in Camberg, lived and worked in Frankfurt. He was in the wholesale textile business, meaning he sold cloth. Now, you would think cloth wouldn't be such a very productive business, but it was, because in those days, many people made their own clothing. And so he would sell to stores as a wholesaler and sell it to stores like my grandfather's store, actually, so that people could buy cloth to make clothes. He was in business with a man named Gustav Druller. And Gustav Druller ended up marrying my grandfather's sister, Rosa. So Rosa's husband, Gustav, and Sigmund May were partners in business, a very successful business in Frankfurt, the big town nearest, the closest large town. There was a fourth brother, Eugene, who died in World War I. At the end of World War I, there was a huge flu epidemic. And we didn't have the medications that we do now, and millions died during this epidemic across Europe. And you will see that my grandmother also had a sibling who died during this flu epidemic. Just to reiterate that the May family had been in this community for generations. This is my great-grandfather, Meyer May. And this is a picture of veterans from the Franco-Prussian War, which was before World War I. And so you can see they have lived in this community. They have fought in wars for this community. This is that upper tower that I showed you earlier. And at this time, if you went outside the old city, which this is a picture of, it was wooded and desolate. Today it is built up, and that's going to play a part in the story later on. Again, there's in the Catholic cemetery in town, there is a World War I memorial, and my father's uncle Eugene is mentioned there because even though he died of the flu right at the end of the war, he was considered a war casualty. So here his name is mentioned as a Jew in the Catholic cemetery in a World War I memorial. On my mother's side, her maiden name was Turkheimer, and they were from a very poor family. And much of the family dispersed because there was not enough money for everyone to make a living. So she had an older brother, Berthold, who came to the United States in 1890, very early on, because again, trying to seek his fortune. He ended up in the cotton business and ended up in New Orleans working for Lane Cotton Mills. He has a couple of cotton baling patents to his name, but he became very successful. He's going to play a role in helping the family. She had a brother, Julius Turkheimer, who really doesn't play a part in this particular story. He died in 1925, but just to mention, she had this other brother. Her brother, Max, is going to play a part. He left and went to Milan, Italy. He went there and went into business selling motorcycles, and he's going to play a part in my uncle's life. And then here her younger brother, Erwin, who also died from the flu epidemic after World War I. So here is a picture of Berthold, and the guy who went to New Orleans. And here's a picture of Max, the uncle who went to Milan. This is now 1928. This is my grandmother, Flora Turkheimer May, and this is her mother, who later in life came to live with the family. And it's her 80th birthday, so her siblings are coming to visit. So this in blue is Berthold Turkheimer, the uncle who went to New Orleans. And he's in blue with my Uncle Paul because he is going to help my Uncle Paul leave Europe and come to New Orleans. Then we have Berthold, and then we also have Max Turkheimer, the uncle who's in Milan. He's in red with my Uncle Martin because he is going to help Martin. Martin will end up going to Milan, Italy, and fleeing Nazi Germany, and then he too will come to New Orleans, care of Berthold Turkheimer's sponsorship. And then this is my dad, Robert. He's going to be helped by his Aunt Emma, which is my grandfather's sister. She's in the picture. I'm not sure why, but I think my grandfather was at work that day and couldn't be in the picture. So she's a representative of the May side of the family. And then again, here you have Berthold Turkheimer, who's going to help my father get to the United States. So these are just some family photos. This is my grandfather, Herman May. And this is that Uncle Gustav Druller who lived in Frankfurt. And this is Uncle Sigmund, the one who was in business with Gustav Druller. And they used to come into Camberg and visit the kids often and their relatives. So they were a common part of, they were a very close-knit family. This is my dad with his parents on the porch. And as I mentioned, because his siblings were so much older, much of his childhood was spent with just he and his parents. His brother has finished high school and has left Camberg, as well as his oldest brother, Paul. So this is the family business. Again, this is the lower tower here. This is the picture that you saw earlier. This is the store. It was called Meyer May after my great-grandfather. And it sold dry goods, it sold textiles, bicycles, clothing, a little bit of everything that a store would need in a small town. My dad says that it looked pretty much the same, except it didn't have this balcony that you see here. So the store was down beneath and the family lived up here. Aunt Emma had this little house next door. So she was in a separate dwelling next door. And as you can see, Herman, my grandfather, took over the business from his father in 1926. So it had been in the community since 1867. These are current pictures of Stolpersteine. Stolpersteine means a stumbling stone. And it's a memorial stone that is being laid throughout Germany in places where Jews who perished lived. And these were laid in 2018 for my Uncle Sigmund and my Aunt Emma right outside of the home there. And you see they are brass blocks that are put into the pavement, and so that when you walk on them, theoretically, you stumble over them to be reminded of the events of the past. Across the street from the store was the grocery store that the family went to. It was called Kring's Grocery, and it still exists today as a health food store. The people who owned this particular store had a little girl that was my father's age that he played with on a regular basis. Also across the street was his uncle's store. Actually, he was a cousin. His name was Moritz, and it was a hardware store. And so with 3 boys in the family and a hardware store across the street that sold guns and gunpowder and tools, you can imagine what kind of a mess those boys got into at Uncle Moritz's hardware store. But as you can see, Uncle Moritz and his wife died, and they have Stolpersteine in front of their home. And this is an interesting story about Arnold Kriegs because, hold on. The Kriegs family was not Jewish, but Arnold Kriegs was, had mental disabilities of some kind. I'm not sure what. And early on in the Third Reich, some of the first victims of Hitler's regime were those who had disabilities, whether they were mental or physical, with the thought being that the Nazis wanted to create a Nazi pure race, and that anyone who was deficient, i.e. that had any kind of handicap at all, should not be allowed to live because they would reproduce and create more people with disabilities. And so Arnold Kriegs was taken into a home and killed. And he also has a Stolperstein for him. So you're going to now hear my father speak about his relationship with the non-Jewish community.
I had an uncle living across the street who had a hardware store, and he was in business when my grandfather had the business. He was a member of the city council, of the general council. So there was interaction, total interaction between all the community, within the community. I remember playing marbles, not with Jewish kids. There weren't any Jewish kids. I played marbles with everybody else. I played soccer with everybody else on the fields. My friends, I went to their houses to play. before Hitler came, and mother had as close a relationship with non-Jewish people as she had with the Jewish people. I mean, we didn't have any Jewish people come to dinner any more so than non-Jewish people. In fact, I don't remember anybody ever coming to dinner. So our association with other people, with outside of the immediate family, was no different with Jewish than non-Jewish people. There were always flags. Germany was always, how should I say, nationalistic. There were always flags. So when the Hitler flag came out, it really didn't impress me per se, except that we didn't fly any flags anymore. There used to be a big flag flying. You know, there's a hole up on there used to be a big pole and I remember putting the flag out, and you used to have sandbags holding the flag down, and the flag was hanging out the window, out the pole, and it was a long flag. It went all the way down, practically to the top of the.
From the second floor all the way down?
It was above the second floor, almost down to the first floor. So, but it was not a swastika. It was red, white, black, red, white. It was a German flag. But then when Hitler came, the Nazi flag came, we didn't fly it anymore.
So essentially from this, you need to think about a community where the Jewish community is not separate from the non-Jewish community. And yes, we will talk about religious life, but they were integrated into the community as welcome as everyone else. In this particular part of Germany and this particular place, they dress like everyone else. You have to remember that in Germany, less than 1% of the population was Jewish, less than 500,000 Jews in the entire country. Now that's not going to be the same as in Eastern Europe when the Nazis invade there. So this was not a huge threatening population to the Nazis. And they were very much in Germany integrated into society. As for Jewish life, I will show you a picture of the synagogue in a minute. The family did keep kosher until 1933, when it was outlawed as you could not have kosher butchering anymore. Keeping kosher means that you do not eat pork, you do not mix milk and meat, and there are various other rules about what you can and cannot eat that are based mostly on cleanliness. On Friday nights, which was the Sabbath, there was always a special meal. They lit the candles. And on Saturday mornings, they went to, my grandfather particularly, went to synagogue because he was the cantor. With a small community like this, there was not a rabbi. And so he led the services because he had a good voice. And my dad used to accompany him to services. But unlike a strict religious, a Jewish community, a real strict Jewish community, my grandfather went to work afterwards because he had to make a living. So in that sense, he was a more reformed Jew or more liberal kind of a Jew. There was a Hebrew teacher who came in from another community to teach the boys Hebrew. And my dad tells the cute story about he hated Hebrew and he had to learn to read it. And the Hebrew teacher was really almost blind, and he used to write in pencil above the Hebrew letters the translation, and the guy couldn't see it, so he was able to cheat that way. So he thought that was pretty cute. This is a picture of the synagogue. As you can see, it's right in the middle of the community. It's about a block from my father's home, and there are homes on either side of it. There's a window here, and in between this window is where the Holy Ark was, and this is a picture of it. The Holy Ark is the place inside the synagogue where the Torah scrolls are kept. The Torah is the rolled up traditional version of the first 5 books of Moses, the Old Testament, that is read every week during the services. And as I said, Herman May was the prayer leader. There was a Jewish cemetery in town. In the Jewish tradition, Jews are buried with Jews because they have certain burial rituals as well. And the cemetery still exists today. There is an old cemetery you can see on the left, and there is a newer cemetery, which is not that new, and this is Meyer Mike, my great-grandfather here, is buried in this newer cemetery. It is still very well kept today. As you can see, this older cemetery is right next to some houses today. But in the time, it's much like that picture from the Franco-Prussian War. This part of town is about 1.5 to 2 miles outside of the old city center. So this would have been in the woods, so to speak, out of town, and that's going to play a role later on. This is my dad's school. He says it pretty much looks the same, except it wasn't painted as nicely, and this would have been dirt here instead of paved. Here's a school also with the Catholic church next door to it. And here's a picture of my dad on his first day of school. He has his iPad with him. You can see he's got an iPad with a wet rag, and he had a slate pencil that he wrote on that screeched when he wrote on it. And that was his paper and pencil for the first several years of school. He's wearing traditional German lederhosen, which are leather shorts. The flap is flipped over, but you'll see later that all the kids wear these lederhosen. They're shorts with suspenders, you know, like you see in the movies. It really is what they wore, because they lasted forever and you didn't have to wash them, and you just kept them until you outgrew them. And it was very low maintenance kind of a clothing. And then in 1933, Hitler comes to power and things begin to change rapidly. And this is the flags he's mentioning, these long flags that the family used to hang the German flag from their dormer. That's what the word he was grasping for. And it would come all the way down to the ground. And flags were very much a part of the culture of the community even before Hitler came to power. So here is him talking about Hitler coming to power.
I think the thing is, we wonder how long he's going to last. He's not going to last very long. When is he going to be toppled? Because he was elected by a minority. And then I remember the night of the long knives. When the SA, the head of the SA was killed, I remember that didn't make sense. What's going on? They're killing each other. So that was a good sign.
So I don't have time to go into all about how Hitler came to power. Essentially, Germany was in dire straits between World War I and World War II. A government was imposed on them, a democratic government by the Treaty of Versailles. They had never had a democratic government before. On top of that, you throw in the Great Depression, and economics were terrible, and legislation wasn't being passed, and the country was struggling. And Hitler was placed in as the chancellor because he had a large following, and they were hoping that he would be able to bring some order to the chaos that was in this interwar period. And then when President Hindenburg died, he became the president. So he never was truly elected. He was sort of placed into power and immediately started usurping powers, and the terror began, so to speak. And so that's a whole nother story that your teachers can potentially follow up on. This is my dad in the 3rd grade. I show you Herbert Pabst because I met him when I went to Camberg in 2018. And he's my dad's age and was a classmate of my father's. And he brought me this picture to show that he and my dad were classmates and good friends. My dad didn't remember him, but apparently he and Herbert used to leave school in the morning and run to my dad's house for snacks in the morning. And my grandmother would give them jelly sandwiches, and then they would go back to school. But Herbert recalled that one time he came to the house and my dad's mother said to him, "Herbert, I don't think you should be here. And is it safe for you to be here?" And he didn't understand what she was talking about. But what she was talking about is that the non-Jewish students were not supposed to be hanging around with the Jewish students. And he said he never really understood what that was. So that's from a child's perspective in the 2nd or 3rd grade. And you can see here the lederhosen, now with our suspenders up. The other thing you notice is when you take your school picture, what does the cameraman always tell you to do? To smile, right? Is anybody smiling here? It's almost like these, the sporting team pictures where they tell the guys, look tough and don't smile. That's kind of the way these pictures remind me. This is my dad in 3rd grade. He still has the same lederhosen, so they're lasting pretty well. And now he's going to talk about how school life changes for him.
The first memory I have of being isolated was the Hitler Youth. They obviously did not include me, and I was jealous and envious of their uniforms, of their community, of their marching, mainly it was a matter of exclusion. It was not an obvious antipathy, but it was an exclusion process.
Do you remember songs that the Hitler Youth sang?
Yeah, I sang it too.
And did you know what it meant? I mean,
Yeah.
and what did it mean? What was the song?
The song was the Horst Wessel Lied, which in München sind viele gefallen. In Munich, many died. We will march in close order, etc., etc. But uncomfortable things came up where signs went up that Jews are no longer welcome in the store, and we don't cater to Jews anymore, that sort of thing. The marches where the people march up and down the street, and the newspaper would go up and be displayed openly across the street from us. The Stürmer. That was so obviously anti-Semitic. I went to school and came home after school and was isolated, and basically we made do as best as we could. The store was boycotted from time to time, and the SA would march up and down the front of the store. It isolated me more, and what happened is I'd go to school in the morning, I'd come back and come home in the afternoon. I don't really think there was fear on my part, but there was fear on my parents' part, because the story that is told that every time somebody with a trench coat and a hat and a satchel and a briefcase would get off the train, my father would quiver. It was the Gestapo coming to visit him.
So a couple of things that he mentioned. One is the Hitler Youth. So the Hitler Youth actually began in 1926. Hitler didn't take power until 1933, but he was developing this movement even before he came to power. And the Hitler Youth was much like a scouting group. They met, they sang songs, they played war games, and they sort of united everybody with a similar purpose: to bring greatness back to Germany. The song that he mentioned, the Horst Wessel song, mentions, he talked about, in Munich, many died. This is referring to in 1926 when they take over the German government by force, and several of the key Nazi players died, and it was sort of their first attempt to take over the government. And that is what that's referring to, and it was always used as a kind of a martyr type situation for the party. Was continually taught, and this was when we tried to do it, and it was a time that was very beholden by the Nazi party. He mentions Der Stürmer, which was a sort of a tabloid kind of a Nazi paper that had a lot of very anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish articles and caricatures, and it was posted around town. It was kind of like the the tabloids that you see in the grocery store when you're checking out, where they have all these bizarre stories about people. This was the sort of text that you would find in Der Stürmer. And so you can see where it's sort of like the walls are closing in on this family. So imagine if your community all of a sudden begins to reject you, and that you used to do, and these words are being spoken everywhere. You're afraid that somebody's coming to get you. He talks about the Gestapo coming after them. So there is this fear, and even though he says he doesn't recall his own fear, I am telling you he was afraid, because even today he has nightmares about Nazis chasing him as an older man. And so there was this internalized fear that he experienced as a young man. This was the municipal hall, the Rathaus, in the center of town. It's where the mayor's office was, and the mayor of Camberg was replaced when the Nazis came to power. They put in a mayor who was very pro-Nazi. In fact, he had 2 young sons who went to school with my dad, who used to chase my dad and call him a dirty Jew. He tells the story about how one time he yelled, they called him a dirty Jew, and he yelled back at them, "Well, you're just a dirty Nazi." And he ran home, told his dad, and his dad said, "Don't you ever say that again. You just keep your head down, and this will all go away." And so for this family, that was their coping mechanism, that certainly this great country of theirs would come to their senses and see what was going on, and that Hitler would be voted out of office, that they would not tolerate these kinds of behaviors. And so they were kind of waiting to see what would happen. And that was a very common reaction by many Jewish families, because they, as we've already shown, they've been here for generations and are part of this community. The store was boycotted, meaning that they had SA soldiers standing out front telling people not to go in and to buy clothing from my grandfather's store. And therefore, economically, the family was hurt because their business was greatly damaged by this. These are some photos of the Hitler Youth. My dad talks about how he was jealous. You know, all the kids in his class show up at school with their uniforms on, and they're these beautiful brown uniforms, and they have these daggers. You know, for a little boy, that's exciting, and he's never had a uniform before, but he can't have the uniform, and he can't go to the meetings after school. And so he was very much left out. He was the only Jewish boy in the school. The boys were separate from the girls. There were a couple of Jewish girls who, there was also a Hitler Youth for the girls, but he was the only Jewish boy. And as he said, after this, he sort of went to school, did his work, and came home. His life that was it. So he experienced his own sense of isolation in that sense. This is the store on the left in red, and here's Kring's Grocery with the little girl Annalisa Kring, who he used to play with. Well, one day a sign goes up at the grocery store that says "No Jews Allowed." He was no longer allowed to play with Annalise, and his mother could no longer shop at this store, so she had to go across town about 2 miles away to buy any groceries that she needed. And then in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed. And these were passed essentially denying German citizenship to the Jews. Now you think about what your citizenship rights give you, and that is the right to vote, the right to police protection, the right to fire protection. All of that was taken away. They could not fly the Nazi flag, which was no big deal. And they also could not have a housekeeper in their home. My grandmother worked in the store, and she had a non-Jewish woman come into the house, and this law did not allow non-Jewish women to come into a household of Jewish people. And so that greatly hindered her ability to be able to do as much work as she should be doing in the store. As for my uncles, Paul was the oldest. He had been in medical school in Frankfurt, and because he was a member of the Nazi Party, which was one of the first targets of the Nazis, he felt he was being arrested. And so he left Frankfurt and left medical school. He moved to Paris and enrolled in the Sorbonne, a university in Paris, to study chemistry. He was not able to get into any kind of a medical school.
Ms. Mollengarden, can I
Yes.
interrupt just for 1 second? Students, if you are making noises into your microphone, I will find out. You will be reprimanded. Stop and be a good Bessemer Academy student. Thank you. Please continue, Ms. Mollengarden.
So after he moved to Paris, he finished up at the Sorbonne, and through a circuitous route through Israel and then Morocco, he was sponsored by Bertold Turkheimer and came to the United States. My uncle Martin was finishing high school when Hitler came to power, and he was no longer able to go on to university, so he took a job in Frankfurt at a Jewish-owned bank. He lived with the Druller family in Frankfurt until that bank was closed. All the Jewish businesses were ultimately closed, and then he left for Milan in Italy to stay with Uncle Max Turkheimer, who sent him to business school and then sent him to England to learn more about the motorcycle business. From England, he was sponsored by Bertold Turkheimer in 1938 and also came to the United States. My Uncle Martin actually fought in World War II for the United States, and my Uncle Paul did also, but he worked as a chemist. But my Uncle Martin was actually in the Battle of the Bulge. So he came in as an immigrant and then fought for the United States. Well, in the meantime, my grandmother has these two sons living in Paris and one in Frankfurt, and she needed to get them money. And you were not allowed to take money anywhere. So she had to smuggle them money. And this was the beginning of her smuggling career. My grandmother was quite a strong woman. And so she would sew money into the lining of her purse and meet her boys in Switzerland. And she took my father with her. Now, my father was a grade school child, and this was a capital offense, meaning you could be hung for smuggling money. And so here she was taking her youngest child with her on this adventure to make it look legit so she could smuggle money to her children. By 1936, life had just gotten too difficult for my father in school. It wasn't that the teachers were ever horrible to him, because he says they were not, but it was the students who treated him the worst. And he was miserable. He had no life, and the family had an opportunity for him to go to Frankfurt. And in Frankfurt, there was a Jewish school, a Jewish day school that he could attend. And his Aunt Emma, who wasn't married, agreed to go with him to Frankfurt and live with him in the Druller's apartment. So there was a place to live, a school to live, and somebody to take care of him. So his parents pulled him out of school at this point. This is before the time when all of these schools were closed to Jews. At this time, there was only a restriction in the number of Jewish students in the school, and his school didn't have many Jewish students. He left on his own. And he moved to this apartment of Gustav and Rosa Druller. Now, Rosa Druller had since died, and Gustav had left Frankfurt, and he and his partner, Sigmund May, had moved to Amsterdam. They had sort of seen the writing on the walls, and they knew that they had sort of made their money for their lifetime, and they weren't going to stick around to see what was happening, so they took their money while they could, and the two of them moved to Amsterdam, where, same just like the Frank family moved to Amsterdam, where it was safe, so to speak, at least for now. Now, the Frank family left in 1933, right when Hitler came to power, partially because Mr. Frank had an opportunity to open up a division of Opekta, the company he worked for there. So they left very early on, 1933. So essentially, Anne grew up in Amsterdam. So anyway, they lived on the second floor of this building. The Druller family owned the entire building, had this whole floor, which for my dad was quite an elaborate apartment compared to what he had grown up in. And he lived there with his Aunt Emma. Here is the apartment, and here is the Philanthropine, the school he went to, so he was literally right around the corner. This is the Philanthropine as it is today. Although it was burned during Kristallnacht, it was only partially burned. This is what it looked like in the time. And these are Stolperstein today that are outside the Philanthropine, only a portion of them, of all of the Jewish students who were students here who died. This was a very advanced school. Most of the teachers had PhDs. And my dad, as he says, he was in the dumb class because he came from this little country town, and he was in the dumb class. This is my dad here. He said he was way in over his head. There were smart city kids here. This is his English teacher, Dr. Plout, and he fondly recalls the first day of English class with Dr. Plout, when Dr. Plout puts on the gramophone and plays Little Jack Horner Sat in the Corner, and the kids began singing the song, and that's how he learned English. So even here, the boys are separated from the girls. When my dad speaks, he talks about his report cards a lot because he did not get great grades. He's sort of like average kind of a kid. But at this school, he was learning English, French, algebra, and geometry. So it was a very advanced school, even for that time. Now, in 1936, we're not 100% sure, but we think is when the family began to apply for a visa. By now, the older siblings are trying to get to the United States as well, and they began to put in for their visa. You can see there are very strict requirements by Germany, things that you have to have. The items in red are the copies that we actually have pictures of, which I will show you later. And then there are requirements for the United States. So this was not an easy process. On top of that, as you can see here, well, I'll show you in a minute, the United States was not letting in many immigrants. As well, if you left around 1936 or 37, you had to give up 90% of your assets to the state. 90% of everything you owned, you had to give away. And if you waited until 1941, you wouldn't have been able to leave at all. So this is why early on, Sigmund May and Gustav Dröller decided they better get out while they can, while they still can take some of their money. Because as you see here, this is immigration to the United States. This is 1933 when Hitler comes to power. This is 1945, the end of the war. How few people are being let into the United States. We were not filling our immigration quotas at this time. We were blocking the entrance of the people that needed to get out of the country, and it was a very difficult time to try to get a visa. So here is Uncle Sigmund moving to Amsterdam in 1936 or 37 with Gustav Dröller. They are both older at this time, and they move into what's called a pension, a place where you live and you get your meals, and they live in the Jewish community there. My dad gets a passport in October of 1938, and you can see by October of 38, the red J has been placed on his passport to indicate that he is a Jew. And then a month later is when Kristallnacht happens, November 9th and 10th, 1938. And this is about, so my dad is in Frankfurt, his parents are in Camberg, so there's sort of two parallel stories. I'm first going to tell you about what happened in Camberg.
Mr. Hartman, Wilhelm Hartman, who used to deliver goods to the store, an SA. Oh, man. Came to my father that afternoon and says, tonight bad things are going to happen. Get out of the house. You can come to my house if you want to. And apparently my father had foresight enough. He had money in the house. He gave him 1,000, 2,000, I don't know how much money, marks for safekeeping. Here, keep this, apparently he told him. This is, I hear from a letter later written. And get out of the house or come to my house. He says, no, I don't want to come to your house because that would jeopardize you. That would put you in danger. So we'll take care of it. So he and my mother, after dark, went to the Jewish cemetery to hide. And the next morning, and they stayed in the Jewish cemetery until daylight, apparently, and they came, after daylight, they came to the store, which is a considerable distance. You had, at least a couple of miles, I'd say, mile and a half. They came to the store, and they saw it destroyed, and the police took him into protective custody and took him to jail. And he stayed in jail for a night or two. How long, I don't know. Later on, they boarded up the store, but the inside the store was destroyed. Everything was turned upside down upstairs. Again, all the windows were broken, all the furniture turned upside down.
And the synagogue in Camberg? What happened to the synagogue in Camberg?
It was demolished. They couldn't set it on fire because the buildings on either side and across the street. So they demolished it by pulling out two window sills, window columns, roof collapsed.
So this is Mr. Hartman, who we actually visited in 1969. He was the guy who delivered packages to the store from the train station. And my dad talks about how he tried to help the family. He is the only person who tried to help the family, warning them, my grandparents, that something bad was going to happen. And so they spent the night in that old Jewish cemetery, which, as my dad says, was outside of town in the woods at the time. Now, you have to remember, this is November in Germany, and it was freezing cold. And so they are there all night long, not knowing what's going on in town and what they are running from per se. And then they return the next morning to find that their home has been, and their store has been destroyed. As you can see from the copy here, it was a tense time, not just here, but leading up to this. And many people committed suicide. Many Jews committed suicide. There were thousands, tens of thousands of arrests on Kristallnacht. My father's family was not arrested, but many were arrested and sent to concentration camps. It turns out there was only one policeman in Camberg who they knew very well, and he very well may have put them into, quote, protective custody to protect them from the other citizens. I learned recently that the SA who did the damage, who were sort of the Hitler's police force, were not the SA in Camberg. They came from a neighboring town, and this was very common in the small towns, but they came from a neighboring town and did the damage in Camberg. So the question is, well, how did they know where to go and what to destroy? They had to have someone to show them, and most likely that was the mayor, who was very pro-Nazi. And so he would show them, go hit that one and that one and that one, and this is where you do the damage. And even for the non-Jewish residents of the community who I've spoken to, this was a terrifying night because you had these hoodlums coming into town doing damage and you not knowing what their target necessarily was. So even the non-Jews were terrified on this particular night. As he said, his parents were taken into protective custody for a few days. The synagogue was destroyed because they couldn't burn it with the close proximity to other homes. They put a chain around this wall between the two windows, tied it to a truck, and pulled it out. And this is the damage, as you see here. The building was eventually completely torn down. As far as what happened in Frankfurt, this is my dad's rendition.
I was in Frankfurt going to school, living with Aunt Emma in a Droller's apartment. And somehow we were made aware that something was going to happen. And we left the apartment. And now, if you picture the apartment, is a floor on a 5-story building. There were people living above us. There was one family living below us. There was a guy on a motorcycle living in the attic. And probably the guy that I imagine that used to ride a motorcycle was the one who informed us, or the one who did the damage, who knows. But I remember going up the stairs. The entrance to the apartment was a glass wall that was frosted over, a frosted glass wall of glass. And we told to get out of the apartment. We walked up and down the streets for how long, I don't know. But the next thing I know is we're coming back up those stairs, and the whole glass is destroyed. Inside, all the mattresses are cut. Inside, all the picture frames and everything is upsy-turvy. Furniture upside down. Feathers all over the place. No outside windows were broken. No outside, nothing on the outside. I remember we walked the streets and we walked by there a few times and we saw nothing. Saw nothing on the outside. So I said, well, let's just sneak in. Now, after we got home, and you could see the school from the back balcony, the back balcony backed up onto the school. There was a big fence back there. You couldn't go from their apartment. You had to go around the side. The school was on fire. I remember collecting shards of glass and that sort of stuff. And I remember somehow or other, a bathroom was a problem. There was a problem in the bathroom. I remember seeing pictures of the synagogue destroyed. Whether I went by it, or walked by it, or drove by it, or took the streetcar by it, I don't.
So this is going throughout the Reich. The Reich right now is not only Germany, but parts of Austria and Czechoslovakia. And these occurrences on Kristallnacht occurred throughout the Reich. This is not their apartment. This is just another image of an apartment that was destroyed. So for my father, his school has ended again. The school was partially burned and not able to reopen. And he, again, usually will tell students about their report cards that his grades, Genügen and good, which is good, good, adequate. You know, again, he's not a great student because he's in this big, highfalutin school. So after Kristallnacht, a levy or a tax was placed on the Jewish community for the damage that was done. It wasn't bad enough that the damage was done, but they were going to be fined 25% of their assets to pay for the damage. And if they had insurance to cover their places of business or their homes, the insurance payments they received would have to be turned over to the government. So it was just a lose, lose, lose on all counts for the Jews as far as what they were liable for. As well, shortly thereafter, there was this decree for the elimination of Jews from German economic life, essentially finalizing that every Jewish-owned business had to be sold. And so it is at this point that my grandfather begins to try to sell his business. So it became like a fire sale. Everything was being sold at rock bottom prices. So even the assets that you had were no longer worth anything. About this time, the British government initiated a program called the Kindertransport. And they said, we will take your children under the age of 17 without your parents to take care of them for the duration of the war. And we will put them in homes, we will school them, we will take care of them. And then after the war, we will reunite with their parents. Well, my dad's uncle Sigmund was in Holland. And he was very much on top of things and somehow found out about this because I'm sure my grandparents did not have the means to know about this. And he contacted a lawyer and arranged for my dad to leave Germany and go to a private Jewish boarding school in England. So because of this relaxation in the laws, he was able to leave Germany. He was not one of these Kindertransport children who was placed into a home. Because when the British did this, it was done through the government and through private organizations, including Quaker organizations, and they were placed in homes. My dad was placed in a school. And my uncle, who had money, paid for his schooling at this private school and for his passage to England. So my dad said goodbye to his parents. He is about 12 years old, and he leaves his parents. His brothers had already left, not knowing what was going to happen with his parents and if they were going to be able to get out, because none of them had their visas to the United States yet. They are still waiting. That started, remember, they started their application for their visas in 1936, and this is now early 1939, almost 1940. So about this time in January was when Jews had to add a Hebraic sounding name to their name. Women had to add Sarah to their names, and the men had to add Israel to their names. To add insult to injury, you had to apply for this. So this is the application that my grandfather placed with the city council in Camberg, asking that his name, my father, and his sister be changed so that Israel and Sarah could be put into their names. My grandmother's not on this because you had to go to your home residence, and she was from Münzesheim, and therefore she would have had to apply for her name change in Münzesheim. For all I know, they even had to pay for this honor to have their name changed. And so you can see in this paperwork, my dad is now Robert Israel Marcus May. So this is the packing list that my father had to have in order to leave. It itemizes everything that he's going to put in his suitcases, and there were those things that were allowed and that were not allowed. You had to have itemized checklists with your suitcase so that when they inspected you at the train station, everything matched up just perfectly. You also had to have certification that you had no outstanding taxes and that you had no outstanding warrants against you, all of this just to leave the country. So my father gets on a train in Frankfurt. He says goodbye to his parents. He stops over in Amsterdam where Uncle Sigmund and Uncle Gustav are living, and then they put him, the train goes on a ship and he makes his way to London here. And my father describes the relief when he gets to the train station and it leaves German territory. He said the train stopped at the end of German territory, then it went about a mile, and then they were in Dutch territory, and the Dutch came on and gave them cookies and milk, and how it was so different than the pressure of being in Germany, and how inspecting your bags was such a traumatic event. You know, you're so worried that you've got something that's illegal or they're going to arrest you and you're not going to get out of the country. So this is a lot for a 12-year-old kid. He goes to a school called the Arie House. As I said, it was a Jewish boarding school, many British kids, but also a lot of refugee children from across Europe. It is here where he had his bar mitzvah with no family except for one distant cousin who ended up coming. His parents are still in Frankfurt waiting for their visas, and his brothers are now safely in New Orleans. In the meantime, there was another movement in England to try to help the adults to get out of Germany. It was called the Small Bones Scheme. And it said that if you have a visa, if you're awaiting a visa for the United States, you may come to England for a limit of 2 years and wait out and get your visa. I guess they assumed that within 2 years you would get your visa. And so my grandparents were able to leave Germany because of this Small Bones Scheme. And they came to England waiting for their visa. And so this is the papers, one of the papers that my grandparents had to sign that says that I will not return to Germany after I have immigrated. And notice my grandmother's now Flora Sarah May. At this time, Aunt Emma, who had been in Germany with him, also goes to Amsterdam to live with her brother and her brother-in-law. My grandmother, before leaving, packs up what they are allowed to take with them and puts it into shipping crates. The shipping crates are waiting in Germany until they get the go-ahead to leave England, and then they would ship out with them. Unfortunately, those crates never left Germany, and we do not know what happened to them. My grandmother had hidden gold coins in the mattresses. She had sewn the coins together and threaded them through the mattress. She had put some jewelry in the hollowed out weights of the grandfather clock. And so my dad jokes that some German is sleeping on a very lumpy mattress full of gold coins and they don't even know it because they stole their mattresses. So my grandmother she had quite a bit of guts. You know, she smuggled money, she smuggled here, and she was the one who really held the family together because for my grandfather, his life was broken. He had once been a very prominent member of the community. He had lost his business. He had lost his status in the community. He was no longer the breadwinner in the family, and really he was a fallen man. So they moved to England on September the 1st, or sometime between September 1st and September 3rd. September 1st is when war broke out and the British declared war on Germany. Germany had invaded Poland. So if they had gotten out any later after September 3rd, they would not have gotten out of Germany because once England declared war on Germany, they would have not been able to get out. So they got out just in the nick of time, and now they're waiting in England to get their visas and essentially doing nothing. In the meantime, the Germans are threatening to invade Great Britain. The Battle of Britain occurred July 10th to October 30th of 1940. So in preparation for that, his school in June evacuated the students to Wales, which is in the western part of the continent, and they lived in this castle. This is a postcard that my dad sent to his parents saying, this is where I lived. He marked an X right here, and they are still in England. And I never was able to talk to my grandparents about what life was like for them in England. So he is in Wales when they finally do get their visas. In August of 1940, he comes back to England to get onto a ship with his parents to come to the United States.
We were on a passenger ship, on an old passenger ship. It was, I remember, and we were third class. We were far from, had a communal shower, didn't have a bathroom in our cabin. remember the dining room had these round seats that were on arms, and the table was a metal table. There was no tablecloth or anything like that. So it wasn't first class. There were other passengers, but not many. It was a long journey. As I remember, it was at least 3 weeks on that ship. I think it was 20 days or something like that. We went from Liverpool almost to Iceland, way north, in a convoy. And I remember standing on the deck with an overcoat on and a hat, shivering in cold weather, and standing under the lifeboat because we were being attacked. There was a boat that was sunk off to our left. And I remember my father saying, let's say a prayer. And we said, Shema. I remember saying that.
So England is at war with Germany right now. And so to leave England, of course, you're going to be a target for German planes. And so they did leave on a convoy, and he describes how one of the ships in that convoy was gunned down. So the point of the convoy was for protection. Their visa took them to Cuba first. That was the plan. And then they were to come to the United States. The unfortunate event was that there was a ruler in Cuba, General Batista, who tried to extort money from these refugees. In other words, to try to get money from them before he would allow them to go to the United States. What he didn't realize that these refugees had no money because it had all been taken by Germany. So they were coming as poor people. So they did put them in some kind of a camp in Cuba, not like a concentration camp as you think of the Nazi camps. But the men were separated from the women. It was fenced in. My dad recalls sleeping in a hammock, and they were there for about 4 to 5 days before they allowed them to board a ship coming to the United States. This is the ship they came on. It was part of this Great White Fleet. It was actually a banana boat, but he describes the contrast between this boat and the boat that he came from Germany as this boat being clean. There was music, the food was fabulous, there were tablecloths on the table, and he thought this is what the United States is all about. He had finally arrived. So he's with his parents coming into New Orleans. This is his ID when he arrives. And he talks about his dad, what his dad did and was like in the United States, and about his 2 brothers, Martin and Paul.
My dad was a shell of himself. I don't think he how should I say? I don't think he had normal reactions. He withdrew. He was mainly interested in surviving of his children. He was more worried about Martin and Paul because they were in the service by this time, and they were so worried about Martin that overshadowed everything else. You think that here are 2 people who have lost everything they've owned, have made a life or try to make a life in a new country, and here their 2 kids are in service. Paul never left the States, but he's potentially could be moved anywhere. And they were probably more worried about being shipped to the Pacific than you were worried about Europe. Martin was in the middle of things, and it literally lived from letter to letter with Martin.
So Martin, as I said, was in the Battle of the Bulge. When he enlisted, His concern was that he would be, if he had been captured, he would have been taken as a draft dodger from Germany even. So he had that to worry about. And whereas most dog tags usually have your religion, he did not want to be Jewish on his dog tag. And so he changed his name when he enlisted, and his dog tag did not reflect his real name. After the war, when he was in Europe, he actually took a Jeep and went to Amsterdam looking for his aunt and uncles because they had lost touch with him during the war. So this is just a picture of the three boys. It's the two older boys who really supported the family at this point in time. My grandfather had a short-lived job as a security guard in a parking deck until one night he was beat over the head for money, and the boys told their father, "You cannot go back to work." He almost died. So my dad comes to the United States. It's 1940, and what do you do with this little German kid coming? His mother takes him to the nearest high school. My dad's the only one that speaks good English. And they said, well, what are we going to do with you? Where are we going to place you? You know German, you know French. Let's give you a math test. So they gave him a math test, and he placed in as a junior. And so he was already way ahead of himself with that. By age 16, he attends Tulane University. And because of the war, everything is going year-round. So it was a very short college years. By 18, he's in LSU Medical School. And then by 1948, his medical school is completed. He begins his residency. And after 1.5 years of his residency, he is shipped off to Eglin Air Force Base to serve as the obstetrician gynecologist for the wives of the men at Eglin Air Force Base. In 1953, he marries my mother, and they leave New Orleans. They go to DC very shortly, and then they ended up coming to Birmingham in the 1950s. I am their middle child. I have an older brother and a younger sister. As far as the family, Aunt Emma, when the Germans invaded Holland in 1940, it was a couple of years before restrictions really hit there. But by 1942, everyone was being deported. This is about when Anne Frank's family went into hiding. Aunt Emma, Uncle Sigmund, and Uncle Gustav were all deported to Westerbork. Aunt Emma and Uncle Sigmund went on from there pretty much immediately to Auschwitz, where they were killed because they were useless. They were older and not able to work. Uncle Gustav, for some reason, went from Westerbork to Bergen-Belsen, where he died shortly after as well. As far as Anne Frank, she didn't end up in Westerbork. I can't remember exactly when the date was where she was outed from her hiding place. I think it was close to 1944. She went to Westerbork and then went on to Auschwitz and then to Bergen-Belsen as well, where she died. Uncle Max Turkheimer, who had helped my uncle in Milan, he was deported directly from Milan to Auschwitz, where he was also murdered. So every one of the family members who had helped my father and his family to get out perished. During the war, they lost touch with them. They weren't sure what happened. And as I said, my Uncle Martin went to Amsterdam trying to look for them. When my grandparents were in England, they were in touch with Emma and Sigmund and Gustav and said, why don't you come to England? It's safe here, then we can go to the United States. And they said, we're very happy here. This is before the Germans invaded. We have a good life here. We can speak the language. We're too old to move. And so they chose not to leave, and they got caught up in the Nazi roundups. This is my dad's sort of comments. I think I asked him, I'm not sure what I asked him, but these are very poignant words that he has to say.
It didn't just happen. It was a gradual slope. And this is the danger of this thing, is that the slope is so gradual and so insidious that it can happen anywhere. And unless it's happening to you, the others don't even notice it. The others who are sitting and keeping quiet. That's why when you see something, you have to speak up. You cannot allow incremental oppression, bullying, what have you, because it leads to something else.
And I think that's kind of the gist of his message, is that, you know, we tend to not pay attention to what's going on to the other person when rights are taken away or when someone is treated poorly because it's not affecting us. And we tolerate one step, and then we tolerate another step, and then we tolerate another step. It just becomes part of life. And the point is that if you don't stop it at some point, it will continue to a point where you can't stop it. This is a window at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum that illustrates the lost communities, meaning Jewish communities that are no longer in existence. And there's Camberg there. This is my family, children and grandchildren, in 2005 when my father took us all back to Camberg. I've gone 4 times. In 1969, I was taken as a child, and then he wanted to take his grandchildren. And then in 2018, I went on my own to work with an archivist there. But I wanted to share the lessons that my father tells students, because this is what he wants students to know, that only in America could this little kid from a small town in Germany come as an outsider, go to school, make a good living, have a good family, and live a good life. And only with family could his family have survived. That family is so important, whatever your family looks like or is, that you have to take care of one another, because in dire times, it is your family that you can turn to. And only with education. His mother was always of the belief that with an education, this is something that no one can take away from you. And so they risked everything so that their children could be educated and that their grandchildren could be educated. They can take away your home, they can take away your business, but if you have an education, you can make a life for yourself. And that lastly, never again should we allow these things to happen. They are happening today. They continue to happen. It seems to be a human nature kind of thing, but we must be vigilant, as he said in that last video. And so that is kind of my dad's story, and I'm going to stop sharing and open this up for questions.
Wow, I hope you guys learned a lot. I sure did. I learned things that I did not know. We have some questions that were put into our group chat. First, I wanted to make a connection for our students that if you've seen the Chronicles of Narnia, when our main characters get on a train and leave to go, that was the Kinder transport. Is that correct, Miss?
I have no idea. My kids read they've read that, but I never read that.
I'm pretty sure Miss Pat is our in-house super expert, and she said that that is true, that is what we see happening in that movie. So that's very, very interesting that you were able to make that connection for us. Let me scroll up to some questions. I had a question. You kept saying the SA. Can you tell us what that stands for?
Okay, so the SA is, and I'm going to butcher the German, but they were called the Stormtroopers. And when Hitler formed his party originally, he wanted a paramilitary force, not a legitimate police, but sort of a police to protect him at rallies and to sort of be his henchman. And believe it or not, it was allowed at the time. Between the two world wars, there were a lot of paramilitary groups, which is foreign to us, that anybody could have a small army and it be legal. But there was. And then when he came into power, he selected some of those more elite members of that group to become the SS, which were the people the guards that eventually became the concentration camp guards and his higher up officials. That night of the long knives that he was referring to was a time, I think it was in 34, when the SA wanted to take over the local German police and become the German police. And Hitler had to weigh, there was a lot of opposition to that because the German people recognized their German police, and then you had this secondary force, the SA, and he realized he has to work within the system, and the SA can't become the German police. And so he had a lot of the leaders of the SA killed because they were the ones that wanted to take over the German police. And that was that fight that he was talking about. You know, what is this going on? What are these people doing? They're killing their own people. which is what they were doing. So that was the SA, and they wore the brown uniforms, whereas the SS wore the black.
Okay. We have another question. It says, so were all Jews discriminated and hated? And also, why were there such extreme measures against them?
Yes, every Jew was targeted from the infant to the adult because according to Nazi racial ideology, the Jews were a lesser race, which in truth, Jews are not even a race, they are a religion. And that even you should not allow the baby to reproduce because then you would have more of these bad people around. And so this was sort of the basis of their ideology, that there were tiers of goodnesses of people, and people with disabilities were not good, Jews were not good, even Eastern Europeans were not good. There was this Aryan race, which was theoretically a more Nordic, stronger, taller, better theoretically, although Adolf Hitler didn't fit that mold either. And as to why the Jews, there's all kinds of crazy theories about that, and none have ever really been proved, except that, during times of strife, there's always needs to be a scapegoat, and they were an easy scapegoat and had been scapegoats for centuries. And they were in prominent positions in the German economy. They had done well in the German economy, so they were very visible. And perhaps, this was part of it. But no one has a solid, quick answer to that question.
We have a comment that's not really, I guess it's not really a question. It says, in Star Wars, the Empire is based off the Nazis' Darth Vader is Hitler. The stormtroopers are Nazi troopers. Have you ever heard that?
No, I don't watch. I'm not a Star Wars fan either.
Not a Star Wars fan either. But that's interesting.
I don't know.
I've also heard that is very, that J.K. Rowling does a lot of that in Harry Potter as well with the purebloods and stuff like that, that there's a connection there. I don't know if that's true.
I just heard an interesting thing that the composer of the music for The Wizard of Oz, that this was composed right around the time of Kristallnacht, and he was Jewish, or they were Jewish. I think it was two men. And that it is somewhat a imagery of Kristallnacht and trying to get to a better world.
Wow. We have one question that says, I'm not trying to be rude, but how did y'all end up in Alabama?
So my dad, after he finished his residency, actually took a job in Washington, D.C. My mother, his family was in New Orleans. My mother was from South Georgia. And they hated it. It was cold, and my dad was in a really big practice where they did, he calls it ghost surgery, where the head doctor comes in and does part of the surgery, and then the little trainee does a lot of the other part of it, and he didn't like that. He wanted to be in control. And so they left Washington, D.C., literally got in their car and started traveling around looking for other opportunities. And through some ad somewhere, there was a doctor here that told them they were looking for another doctor, and they ended up in Birmingham because they wanted to be closer to their families.
Very cool. Somebody asks, are you still a practicing Jew?
I am, yes.
Awesome, great. And somebody says, what time in the war did your dad join the U.S. military?
It was during the Korean War. So World War II was already over, and it would have been during the Korean War. So he was not sent to Korea to fight. He served as a medical person in Florida.
One person says, if I'm not mistaken, I thought you said one of your uncles were in the war. Is that true? And what position was he in the war?
I don't know his actual title. I mean, he was not anything big, anything. He did fight in the Battle of the Bulge, though.
And it says what happened to him.
He survived. Like I said, after the war, he went looking for the family in Holland. He ended up settling in New Orleans. He became an artist. He had always been very artistic and worked for an advertising agency and was there until Katrina. And when Hurricane Katrina hit, he evacuated to Portland, Oregon, where his daughter lived. And so we have no more family in New Orleans because they were all wiped out during Katrina.
Oh, that's so sad. Somebody said, so they put Israel in the men's name because the Jews are from Israel?
No, they wanted a Hebrewish or something indicative name, and they considered Israel a Hebrewish sounding name, as well as Sarah. They're sort of biblical names, and they wanted a way to readily recognize a Jew as a Jew. I don't know how it worked if your name was Sarah already. You'd be Sarah. And if you weren't Jewish and your name was Sarah, you were really out of luck, because they all of a sudden are going to think you're Jewish maybe. I mean, it's indicative of the Nazi, the way they did things. They just didn't think things out really clearly. The other interesting thing is there were many people who all of a sudden became Jewish after the Nuremberg laws were passed. In other words, the Nuremberg laws said if you had even a grandmother who was Jewish, that you were considered Jewish. So imagine if your grandmother was Jewish, but your parents were raised not Jewish, and you were raised not Jewish, and all of a sudden they pass these Nuremberg laws and they have these genealogists. You've got to prove your non-Jewishness, and you find out that your grandmother way back was Jewish, then according to German law, you were Jewish and you could be persecuted. And so all of a sudden you had people finding out that they had Jewish blood that they didn't even know about, or Jewish heritage, and they were being persecuted.
Wow, I did not know that. Somebody asks, is your dad friends with any Germans today, or did he cut everybody off?
He did not seek out Germans. He was very much assimilated. My grandmother in New Orleans, because German was her first language, was more comfortable speaking German to friends. And so in New Orleans, there was a German immigrant community that she was very comfortable in, but not for my father.
This is a great question. Did your family change their names back after they immigrated?
Their name was always May. Actually, in German, it's Mai, Mai, or Hermann Mai. That's how they pronounce it, but that was a German name.
Did he get rid of the Israel? Did your
father? Oh, yes. Yeah, that was, even when he came to the United States, that was not part of his name.
Okay. We're not talking about Darth Vader. Come on, guys. Thank you, Miss Eaton, for saying that. She's like, stop talking about it. Okay, I think those are all of our questions. Those are great questions.
I do want to share one other thing just real quick, because it is interesting. My dad was here in Birmingham in the 1950s. And in Birmingham in the 1950s, we had the Civil Rights Movement. So he was a physician here in Birmingham, and he had an office on south side of Birmingham. And he had to have separate waiting rooms. His patients would not sit with each other. And so they had a black waiting room and they had a white waiting room. But when the patients were to be seen, they all went back to the same back office. And it wasn't that he wanted that, but he said he had to do that. And he recalls things like he used to see patients down at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And he recalls seeing the black patients were put in the basements of the hospital. There were dirt floors and they were wards. And he says, you know, the conditions were terrible, but the same doctors were treating them as the other patients. And he recalls also when they went to look for a house. As Jews, they were not able to buy a house. My mother had looked at some houses while my dad was at work, and she didn't look Jewish. And the real estate agent showed her a couple of houses in Vestavia Hills. And then when my dad came with her to look at those houses, the agent said, well, I didn't realize you were Jewish. You can't buy a house in this neighborhood. And so they had these sort of their own little restrictions within the community being Jewish. My dad could not join the Jefferson County Medical Society and be an officer because he was Jewish. You know, so there was anti-Jewish stuff going on in Birmingham even when they got here, in addition to the anti-Black stuff going on. Wow.
So somebody made a comment. Oh, it went away. Where did it go? She said, sorry. She said, so he knows exactly how the Black people felt because he got a glimpse of it in Germany.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm glad they're making those connections. Thank you for helping them make that connection.
Yes.
Question from Brooklyn. Did your family ever want to move back to Germany after the war?
No. My dad only went back reluctantly to show us. He felt it was important for us to see where he came from. But when we went back as children, the only person we looked up was Mr. Hartman. He had no interest in seeing anyone else. There was still a lot of anti-Semitism there in the 1960s. My dad would never buy anything German made, German car, German products, anything like that. He loves German food, but he wanted nothing to do with the country, and none of the family either.
All right. I actually had wondered that myself, if he wanted to return to his homeland or not. I mean, but I guess with such bad memories, you wouldn't want to go back there.
The other interesting thing is that Germany has offered citizenship to children and grandchildren of survivors. And two of my three kids have gotten German citizenship because they wanted the right to be part of the EU and be able to, if they ever wanted to work in Europe. So in that sense, we did get something out of all this. My youngest son has worked in England and was able to do so because of his EU citizenship.
Another quick question. Whatever happened to the police officer that helped your grandparents?
I don't know of anything. I don't think, nothing that I know of. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think for my classes, hold on one second. For my classes, guys, if you look on my website, there is a response that I need you to fill out for our speaker, just to make sure that you are paying attention and to give some feedback for her and for me, because I love hearing these stories, and it's so important to keep these stories alive so that we don't repeat this horrible thing that happened in history. So you have an assignment. It's on my website that you need to click on to do that. I'm sure other classes, their teachers have their own thing that they're going to do. But I would like to thank you so much, Miss Mollengarden, for being here with us. I know we have another class starting in about 20 minutes, so we're going to take a break, go get coffee, whatever we need to do.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. I'm going to end out the meeting. Bye, guys.
Stay well.